Thank you. Mr. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I wanted to thank the two of you for coming over here. And I don't want to retread too much of what's been asked and what will continue to be asked about Ukraine, but I did want to just point out my strong urgence to the administration to really follow through on the priority lists that the Ukrainians are providing us in terms of what security defenses are there, and for us to take that close look, including on the jets, including on the long-range air defense systems and things of that nature. You know, I think at this stage in the conflict, especially when we're seeing this, our own administration highlighting the war crimes that are happening against the Ukrainian people, that we recognize that, you know, some of this equipment, it's not offensive capabilities if their country is being invaded. You know, these are defensive capabilities that are trying to address this in that kind of capacity. It's not quite escalatory in that same way if we're thinking about this as that defensive effort. So I just wanted to say that, but look, I know you're getting lots of questions on that. What I also wanted to just raise is, I know that we have had so many conversations lately with our NATO partners about this new era of NATO and what this means going forward, this new posture that we have. I was with many of you at the Munich Security Conference when we were talking about this just before the war started. So as there's this greater solidarity within NATO, I guess I wanted to ask you, and I'll start with Dr. Wallander, when we look at this threat that NATO is facing and the investments and the increased investments that countries are saying that they're willing to make, what is that looking like right now in terms of the conversations? Obviously, there's the security threats that we face with Russia right now, and that's important, and that's something that we need to posture towards. But what we also recognize is that, you know, the next great threat to NATO may not necessarily come in the form of tanks rolling across, you know, Eastern Europe. You know, we have had a lot of concerns about cyber, about space, about hypersonics. And honestly, in this room, we've talked a lot more about just the greater threat when it comes to China and the Chinese government going forward, even more so than we have of Russia. So I guess I wanted to ask, when we're having those conversations with our NATO partners about this new mission, this new era of NATO, how is that factoring into the broader effort? Are we making sure that we're looking at this comprehensively across the topography of threats that we face?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, and the answer is yes. The Russian aggression has galvanized, and China's failure to stand on the right side of history in calling Russia out for its aggression, and reports that China may be entertaining the thought of helping Russia cope with the effects of sanctions and some of the restrictions, has really galvanized European leaderships and publics to understand that China is a global challenge and threat, not just one in the Asia-Pacific region, and that China, like Russia, extends its malign influence through corruption, through some questionable commercial and economic means, and through cyber as well. And so working with NATO and the EU, it is possible now, I think, to elevate U.S.-European cooperation on the global challenge that China poses. And those conversations are happening even as we speak.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. And in general, I love your thoughts on this as well, because, you know, as we are talking about NATO, obviously, yes, there is an immediate concern about NATO's role when it comes to this European threat. But what we've also known is that, yes, the transatlantic alliance and the effort there is focused on Europe as well, but there's a global role for NATO as well, and that's certainly something that we have in mind when it comes to even the Indo-Pacific area. So I love your thoughts, just kind of building off of Dr. Wallander, your conversations with NATO partners and whether or not they understand that gravity of not just thinking about this in terms of Russia, but more broadly as well.
NATO is very engaged in that area. The Secretary General will host a leaders summit at the end of June in Spain, and he will introduce with the leaders the NATO 2030 strategy, and it touches on this very issue by making sure that we look inside and outside of our area of responsibility in our European continent to grasp all of the issues that could impact security for Europe, and obviously the focus on China is part of that. And the SecGen has been very, very loud about that, and I'm pleased to report that the NATO 2030 strategy will take that into account.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. I think it's just so important that we think about this in that strategic plan, not just about the challenge and the threat right at our door, but also thinking about what's down the road, what might be coming next. So thank you for your attention to
Thank you.
that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Banks is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, in layman's terms, can you explain what a escalation avoidance strategy actually means?
Do not enter into World War III.
What does it mean specifically? I mean, what define it? How does it apply in this case?
Every action has a reaction, and if that reaction gets you closer towards sparking and starting World War III, you need to go back and readjust what your activity is.
Okay. On March 25th, USNI News reported that the president of Latvia, President Levits, argued that if NATO had reacted more strongly in 2008 to Russian aggression against neighboring Georgia and the Kremlin's 2014 annexation of Crimea, Moscow wouldn't now have invaded Ukraine. Additionally, he said that the appeasement tactics, quote, are not fruitful. General, has a U.S. escalation avoidance strategy with Russia prevented Russian aggression in Ukraine?
Ensuring that you have NATO unity has ensured greater peace across the European continent. With respect to your question as it applies to Ukraine and Russia, Russia gets a vote on this, and Russia's responsible for their invasion.
Okay. General, why did Putin decide to invade Ukraine right now?
I think he felt like he had...
Why not any time between 2014 and 2022? Why didn't he invade, but why did he invade now?
I think he felt like he had popular support of the citizens of Russia. I also felt like he was attempting to take advantage of fissures that could have appeared in NATO as a result of the post-Afghanistan environment. And I also think it has to do with his age and his efficacy. And all those combined together put him in a position to where he elected to go at this time. But the overriding variable, in my view, is the fact that he believes that he has popular support with his citizens.
Russia's invasion has heightened concerns about NATO's ability to defend NATO member states, particularly the Baltic states, from a possible Russian military attack. What is your assessment for NATO member states' willingness and capacity to respond to an intentional or inadvertent attack on a NATO member state?
We have changed and will continue to change our military posture, not just in Eastern Europe, but in all quadrants. And that activity, as you're well aware, is ongoing. And the degree of cooperation from the nations is as strong as we've seen.
The Washington Post reported on March 11th that President Zelensky pleaded for the MiG-29 transfer while having support from a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers, including many of us in this room. And the Biden administration, citing assessments from senior American military commanders in Europe, has said the additional aircraft would offer only minimal value to Ukraine given the contested nature of its airspace. Do you still agree with that assessment?
I do, Congressman.
Russia is bombarding Ukrainian civilians. Ukraine obviously needs equipment for air defense. What equipment should the U.S. or NATO provide Ukraine for it to defend itself from Russian aerial attacks?
I'd like to address this more in a classified setting, but it goes directly to your point about defining what the problem actually is in the battle space and targeting that problem.
Understood. I look forward to those answers in a classified setting. The Trump administration was the first administration to provide Ukraine with javelins and significantly increased lethal aid to the Baltic states. Why is the U.S. or its NATO partners not supplying more anti-aircraft defense systems to Ukraine?
So again, in a classified setting, I can give you the contributions per nation in this particular area, and I think it might clear the air a little bit about what is actually going to the Ukrainians.
General, is NATO too concerned with escalation to more effectively support Ukraine?
NATO is very concerned about effectively supporting Ukraine and also very concerned about ensuring that we manage escalation appropriately.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We'll now recognize Ms. Slotkin from Michigan.
Thank you to both of you for being here. I know we're in hour 2 here, 2.5, and I can't think of two better people to come and talk to us about these issues right now, both of you. Many of us are very affected by this Ukrainian parliamentary delegation that's here in town that was sent to kind of advocate. I met with them this morning, and their position is that, in contrast to what the media is reporting about the negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that the Russians are not at all being benevolent about pulling back from cities, that in fact, anywhere they're announcing they're pulling back are areas where the Ukrainians are kicking them out. Can you speak to that? Is that a correct characterization? Do we see anything that connotes any kind of pullback by the Russians at all in the name of peace?
Congresswoman, some small maneuvering of forces, I believe, for the purpose of adjusting the campaign to go into a different geographical region. And as a military commander, as you well know, I can't trust anything with respect to a potential foe. So we continue to remain vigilant in all areas, and we certainly anticipate that this area will be readdressed by the Russians in the near future.
Okay. We were also told that a new list of equipment and support requests was transmitted to the Department of State and Department of Defense. Are you two aware of this request? And either way, who in the Department of Defense is the senior-most person responsible for metering out the new request from the Ukrainian government?
We have a request from the Ministry of Defense as recently as yesterday. I do not know if it's the same list as the one you were handed. I'm guessing it is. The responsibility for security assistance assessment is managed in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, including my chain of command, and it is something we work on every day.
Is there a unit or a task force or some emergency group that's been stood up at the Pentagon that's specifically looking for the Soviet-era weapons that the Ukrainians have so desperately asked us for? And if so, who is the head of that unit?
That would be led by my office in cooperation with other components of DoD, including DSCA, Joint Staff, intelligence community, and diplomatic outreach.
So there is a task force or something that's set up, or it's housed in your office?
It's housed in our office.
Okay. Can you just give us the official position? You've heard a bunch of us ask about the equipment of the planes, the Soviet-era planes. What is the official position of the Department of Defense on providing or helping to facilitate Russian-made aircraft that the Ukrainians have asked for?
The official policy is that countries that wish to donate, that have those Soviet legacy aircraft, it's their sovereign decision. We ask those countries, if they're NATO allies, to consider the potential escalation dynamics and that balancing of risk that General Wolters has explained so well. And we are listening to the Ukrainians carefully on what they need and working to fulfill their requests as diligently as we are able.
Okay. Just a couple of additional questions. Dr. Wallander, you've talked about watching the China-Russia relationship, and obviously I think for a lot of us here, it's very interesting to think about what China is learning from all of this. We know that there's been some military cooperation exercises, those kinds of things. We know there's been talks between the Russians and the Chinese. Have you seen any evidence, classified or otherwise, just yes or no, that the Chinese are working with the Russians on non-conventional military means, so cyber attack in particular?
No.
Okay. Have you seen any other evidence that the Chinese are aiding and abetting the Russians other than sort of the kind of conversations that they've been having and sort of the basic supplies that they've been providing, things like MREs?
No.
Okay. And then lastly, I would just say, I think there's a lot of interest in sort of the future of NATO, with Finland and Sweden making noises about being interested, with other countries like North Macedonia trying to get in. Just very briefly, is there any plan to change the criteria, to think differently about how fast NATO membership goes, knowing that it's typically a very slow process?
I'm not aware of any assessment to change the timeline. The criteria remain the same, and the membership is driven by the desire and the request of potential new allies.
Appreciate it. I think North Macedonia is the one that we hope will be broken in sooner rather than later, for a whole bunch of reasons. But thanks very much for your time. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to build on the comments of some of my colleagues. And I think we need to recognize, and we need to do so in a very clear-eyed way, that deterrence did fail. The fact that we have cities that are now leveled, it's notable that NATO is now unified. It's notable that Germany is reversing its long-held positions, whether it's on energy or on its defense spending. But we have 4 million refugees in cities that are leveled because deterrence failed. So just to be clear, General Wolters, you agreed deterrence failed?
Reference the parameters that you just talked about, no argument.
I mean, saying that our Asian allies are unified after Taipei is leveled, right? We need to apply these lessons and these failures and lessons learned on what failed up front. And I think on top of the lack of response 2018, lack of response in 2014, we now had New START, which is the Russians' top priority, extended cleanly with really nothing in return, lack of response to the colonial pipeline, the lifting of sanctions on Nord Stream 2, not to mention the Germans and others' posture beforehand. And I think part of that, when I was out on a visit, was the continual message that we heard out in Kyiv was that the weapons that the Ukrainians were asking for as recently as December would have been too escalatory, including the Stingers. General, would it have made a difference if the Ukrainians had had Stingers months ago, had the opportunity to train on them, and had them on day one? Would that have made an operational difference in their ability to fight?
Congressman, it could have. And as we talked about before in our discussions yesterday, as we always do in the military, which you're very familiar with, we've got to go back and scrub this from cradle to grave and make sure in every potential soft spot we look where some of the flaws are and make corrections. And that may very well be one of the areas. I don't know.
I mean, in fact, we were told that we couldn't, the United States couldn't give, this committee was told that we couldn't give them Stingers because we didn't have any export variants, only to find out 8 weeks later it was literally 3 screws and a component that had to be taken off. And I think we owe that to the Ukrainians, and we owe that honest assessment to ourselves. In the same vein, we talked about how sanctions are biting on the Russian logistics system. Would it have been effective if we had had those sanctions 6 months ago in place and more effective now?
It could have been, and we need to scrub that as well.
Okay. Just switching to the Black Sea, which we talked about as well. Do we currently have any U.S. ships in the Black Sea?
We do not.
When did those, I believe it was 2 DDGs, when did they move out?
It was in the January timeframe,
Pre-invasion.
pre-invasion.
That was a policy decision to vacate the Black Sea.
It was.
Dr. Wallander, what was the policy decision to essentially cede an ocean, or cede the Black Sea, excuse me, to the Russian Navy?
Congressman, I was not in office at the time, but I owe you an answer, and I will get back to you with an answer of the assessment.
Okay, but at your assessment now, we're not putting any force structure in now to, I mean, literally, as Russian ships are bombarding Mariupol, and by the way, we didn't give harpoons because those could have been too escalatory. So let's speak to the now, but I would appreciate an answer. I mean, what I understood as the policy decision was that ships in the Black Sea would be too escalatory, and we didn't want to provoke the Russians. I think we're seeing a theme here that we need to be very, very careful of as we move forward, and that a fear of escalation could actually invite the escalation from the other side. But in terms of the ships now, and General, are we flying over the Black Sea now with any military assets?
We are, Congressman.
Directly over? Or not on the periphery, but actually?
We are overflying the Black Sea with unmanned aerial systems, and in the southern portion with manned systems and commercial.
Great. Last question. In terms of training the Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, are we conducting any training of the Ukrainians outside of Ukraine?
We are not, Congressman. That there is some advising taking place with liaison officers to ensure that we can get the appropriate
Dr.
flow.
Wallander, as a policy matter, why are we not training them?
I am not aware of any requests from the Ukrainians to train outside. So
Ukrainians don't want to be trained on the weapon systems that we're providing them?
I believe the Ukrainians are fighting in the country at this time. I am not aware of any requests, but I owe you a good answer on whether we have received such requests.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's time
Chairman.
has expired. I will let people know we're breaking at 12:30, so if we don't get to your questions in the public session, we are having a classified session at 1 o'clock. We'll prioritize people who were not able to ask a question here in the classified section. But at 12:30, we turn into a pumpkin. We give these folks a break before we then do the classified session at 1. So we'll get to as many as we can before then. With that, Ms. Sherrill is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I echo many of the chairman's comments on Paul Arcangeli. I'm sorry to see him go. General Wolters, with the establishment of a theater fires command in Europe, will the Army look to deploy more ground-based surface-to-surface indirect fire assets, such as the Urka, to the European theater, especially given that currently Russian artillery outranges ours?
Congresswoman, that's a possibility, and I hearken back to post-conflict with what has taken place right now. After we have a deep scrub with respect to an after-action review, this will be one of the areas that we address. But the theater fires construct is exactly what we need, and we're excited about going forward with that.
So in that vein, will these systems, do you expect they'll meet the needs of, these type of systems meet the needs of the Theater Fires Command, or are you going to look towards more ground-based extended range hypersonic projectiles such as the SLRC?
We'll look at as many domains as we possibly can to use those capabilities. And again, we'll be able to fine-tune our focus once we have a post-conflict scrub on this particular area. But again, as many domains as possible is better when it comes to deterrence and defense.
And can you speak a little bit more about that, about the importance of having an all-weather, surface-to-surface precision fires capability in Eucom?
Congressman, I'll just state that having those capabilities that impact as many domains as possible, that have the ability to range with precision, complicates the task for a potential enemy against us, so it dramatically improves your deterrence posture, and that's all positive.
Thank you. And further, regarding the ongoing war in Ukraine, we've seen multiple reports regarding the Russian military's logistical challenges, with stopped convoys, abandoned vehicles, and stranded forces, all leading to a loss of combat power that's proving deadly to Russian forces on the ground. Although Eucom's taking steps to guarantee infrastructure that would allow for freedom of maneuver throughout the AOR, what steps are we taking to ensure logistical efforts will be successful in a contested environment, particularly with fuels and/or power sources? Are we looking at new fuels or power sources for to make sure that we maintain our logistics in theater?
We are, Congresswoman, and it first starts with the independence that we must possess for the basics. That's electricity and gas, and it goes back to some of the previous discussions that we've had. As you know, we stock additional gas and we stock additional generators for the purpose of having expeditionary services to go to in the event that certain systems are shut down. And we need to continue to advance that independence with all the areas that you alluded to, and that is actually part of future plans.
Thank you. And then, you know, with respect to our preparation and supporting the Ukrainians, under the previous administration, we know President Trump withheld javelins, contrary to the expectations of this committee. Are the javelins proving to be important in the fight now against the Russians for the Ukrainians?
Yes, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And as we're looking towards how we are going to move forward united with our NATO and Eucom partners, Dr. Wallander, have you seen this administration working incredibly hard in close support with our NATO allies?
Yes, Congresswoman.
And has that been an important part of our fight against to make sure that we are isolating the Russians from the world community?
It's been vital to isolating Russia, helping Ukraine, and sending a credible message to Russia.
And as we're looking to support the Ukrainians, have we done so with our NATO allies, and have we gotten the Ukrainians much of what they need to be as successful as they have been currently in this fight against Russia?
We have been coordinating and communicating with NATO allies with their willingness, and we've been communicating many of the requirements that the Ukrainians convey to us so that allies that have those capabilities and are willing to provide them are able to do so.
Well, thank you very much. I was in Ukraine meeting with President Zelensky shortly before the Russian invasion, and much of what he asked for, the Stingers, the Javelins, and the support for ammo on the ground, I see that we have provided him, and it seems as if it's been very successful for the Ukrainian people in their fight against Russia, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Franklin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Wolters, to follow up on Representative Waltz's questions, I'm still a little confused about the messaging on what we're doing in Poland. A week ago, the National Security Advisor said we were doing no training. Then President Biden said we were. And then yesterday, a senior administration official said that U.S. troops help Ukrainian forces in Poland load weapons the West gives them. As they do so, they provide verbal instruction on how to use the weaponry, like anti-aircraft missiles, but don't lead Ukrainian forces through physical drills. Very mixed messaging. It's confusing to all of us. Did anyone in the White House coordinate any of those statements with you as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe?
No, Congressman.
Okay. Not asking you to elaborate in this setting specifically what we may or may not be doing with Ukrainian soldiers. I'll defer that to a classified session. What is your military advice on publicly talking specifically about how we train the Ukrainians?
Can you quantify that question? I'm having a hard time grasping what the question is.
Well, should we be talking publicly about what we're doing specifically on the ground, tactically, with our allies?
Not publicly, Congressman.
Thanks. So, General, I think we've witnessed a change in defensive tactics during this invasion of Ukraine that few really expected. We've all seen decimated Russian armor columns and the takedown of relatively sophisticated fighters by cheap and plentiful weapons. I know there'll be a lot for tacticians to chew on in our war colleges when the war ends, but it already looks clear that the 20th century tactics of mass land warfare aren't as effective today as they were when Eastern Europe was last invaded during World War II. Do you think the Ukrainian strategy of low-cost, high-volume kinetic weapons is a feasible strategy for future conflicts against competitor nations?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with all the parameters of the so-called Ukrainian strategy, but I will tell you that one of the things that makes a huge difference is what's in the heart of the citizens and their support for the military activities. And I think after this is all said and done, when we go back and take a look at what transpired, that is one of the areas that has made a big difference, certainly up to this point, and we still have a long ways to go.
Well, clearly, and we've all been just amazed at the tenacity of the Ukrainian fighters, and I think there's a lot to be said for the training that we've conducted side by side with those allies, not just the Ukrainians, and also the high impact of relatively low-cost things like drones, Stingers, Javelins. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have if they can be taken out pretty simply with low-tech weapons. Do you think the calculus of investing in high-value, high-tech, long build time systems will or should shift in the DoD to favor more nimble and expendable systems?
Congressman, I think that's going to be one of the areas that we have to take a deep look at, and that mixed with capabilities that are less elegant need to be factored into this discussion, and we have to be willing to listen very closely about what we've learned, and then we'll make adjustments.
Roger that. Finally, last question. Do you see the possibility of amending our current offensive and defensive strategies with the lessons we're learning in Ukraine, and if so, what might those look like? And I know it's early to be making those kinds of assessments.
I think we have to always be willing to adapt to change and listen to every possible input in every part of any conflict. And this is one of the areas that no matter how insignificant we think some issue may be, we've got to pay attention to it. And I think if we're a good learning organization, which the department certainly is, we'll take all that into account as we press forward. But yes, we have to learn from what unfolded in this particular conflict. We still have a long ways to go, though.
Roger that. Thank you, General. Now I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crow is recognized. When he's done, we're going to take our break at 12:30. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock upstairs for the classified portion of the hearing. Mr. Crow is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for coming in today. I wanted to start by just addressing a comment that one of my colleagues made earlier about concerns about intelligence failures. And General Wolters, you had said that you guys would conduct an assessment of where you were soft and areas where you can improve, which I appreciate. But I sit on both the Armed Services and the Intel Committee, and I have to say, we nailed it. So starting back last fall, we started to determine what was happening. We were ringing the alarm bells, and we engaged in an unprecedented public engagement and private engagement with our allies, with the international community, releasing, declassifying information, getting the Ukrainians prepared to address this. This is, in my view, one of our generation's finest intelligence successes, and something that I think we should talk more about. And I just wanted to say that, and I hope you all agree, because yes, we can always improve, and that's the military mindset, General Wolters, which I appreciate. There's always room for improvement. That's why we do AARs. But I think it's important to say that the intelligence community and the military did an exceptional job, and I want to point that out. So starting with Dr. Wallander, I've been in regular communication with Ukrainian military and civilian leadership, and they have provided me with a document that's entitled The Urgent Needs of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in a Priority Order. And it lists 17 items, and it goes into extreme detail. I wanted to ask both of you, have you received and are you familiar with this list?
Yes.
And General Wolters?
Yes.
And is the Department of Defense looking at this list in a detailed way and going down these requests?
Yes.
And is the Department of Defense prepared to, either in a classified or non-classified setting or on the record, provide this committee with an analysis of all these requests and either what we're able to comply with or what we're not, and if we're not, the reasons why we're not?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then kind of broadening out in terms of our security cooperation, a couple of weeks ago there was this issue of the providing of MiGs through Poland that occurred, and the administration came out, and I think, General Wolters, you made it clear that you thought that providing fighter jets would not be appropriate at this time. And yet we continue to hear from Ukraine this would be not a game changer necessarily, but an important element to Ukraine's defense, that it would allow them to project power, particularly in the south and the east, to Mariupol and other places where they cannot, allow them to cut off supply lines. So I'm trying to, and they also have told me that they're rebuilding their airfields. They have airfield capability. They have logistics support capability. They have pilots that are able to fly it, and they can support it, and that would make a difference. And it strikes me that Ukrainians are not going to ask necessarily for something that they can't use in most instances because they're fighting for their survival. So could you both tell me where are we on the fighter jet issue? Is that something that we are taking a fresh look at? Number one, and number two, this issue of escalation. Does the administration draw a line at vehicles, at aircraft and vehicles? Is that determined to be too escalatory, and we're only going to provide things short of that? Dr. Wallander, we'll start with you.
Sure. I don't believe that the position of the Department of Defense, both the policy side and the military best advice, has changed on the assessment, although I defer to General Wolters.
On the fighter jets?
On the general issue that you raised about, have we changed our position on that? Yes.
Okay.
And on the issue of ruling out certain kinds of vehicles, I think it is capabilities driven rather than particular kinds of vehicles, but we can pursue this and get into more detail in the next session.
And Congressman, I'll just add, good departments allow commanders to provide best military advice. I continue to assess, and I do know with Secretary Austin, he expects me, if I deem so, to provide best military advice to change courses. And at this time, that is not my best military advice with respect to the aircraft. And I can elaborate on that a little bit more in a classified setting.
So just before we go into classified setting, though, so understand, so it's your best military advice that the United States or its allies should not provide fighter jets to Ukraine at this time. Is that accurate?
It is my best military advice that the U.S. doesn't, and it's also my best military advice that we allow nations to independently make their decision about what they would like to offer the Ukrainians. I don't want to thwart any of that.
Okay, well, we're out of time, and we'll follow up on in a classified setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Very thorough. We will continue in a half hour in 2212 with our classified portion.